The Honourable Member for Dufferin-Caledon.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm happy to stand today to add my voice to this debate. I think it's a particularly important debate. It's an important subject, and I think there are a lot of issues that need to be discussed. I'm going to confine my comments to issues that I find with the bill, things I'm concerned about, and my genuine belief that the government will take a very collaborative approach to this legislation, because if we have a collaborative approach to this legislation, Canadians can then have the trust and faith that we have developed legislation that will actually address the needs and protect the concerns. Speaking of the concerns, I have a number. I'm going to start off by talking about what I consider to be a significant lack of consultation. This legislation is due to come up for review in June. It's the 5-year mandated review of the legislation. My understanding as well is that the government has applied for a 4-month extension with respect to the implementation of this legislation that the Quebec court struck down. So if we have this 4-month extension and we have a mandated review of the legislation scheduled in June, my first question is this: what is the rush? Why have we rushed to introduce legislation prior to having that mandatory review, which of course would be extensive and broad and far more in-depth than any consultation that has been done with respect to this current piece of legislation? My understanding as well is that there was only about a 2-week public consultation or input that was available for this legislation, which, in my opinion, is woefully deficient given the gravity of this, the topic that we're discussing today. So this is my first real concern. What's the hurry? What's the rush? The court has given us more time to do this, and I believe we should be taking the time to go through a mandatory review, consult with Canadians, and then decide on the path forward. That's my number one concern. I apologize. I also want to put out that I'll be sharing my time with the member for Langley-Aldergrove. Thank you for the page for bringing that to my attention. She's doing an excellent job. So one of the first things the next thing I want to talk about is palliative care. And the minister has made comments in the House today espousing the great investments that are being made by their government in health care, but not really talking about any specific investments with respect to palliative care. And I think that's a critical thing to look at when we discuss this legislation. And I want to remind the minister that legislation that was passed, an act providing for the development of a framework for palliative care in Canada that was passed in the previous Parliament in 2017, it clearly states this: whereas the final report stated that in the preamble, whereas the final report stated that a request for physician-assisted death cannot be truly voluntary if the option of proper palliative care is not available to alleviate the person's suffering. So this is something that was passed by this Parliament. So when we look at expanding the scope of medically assisted death without also expanding the scope of the availability of palliative care, I think we're doing an incredible disservice to Canadians, because the availability of palliative care in this country is poor at best. I'm going to speak about this personally just for a moment. Both my parents suffered from terminal cancer. My mother was not able to get into a palliative care facility because there was no palliative care facility available for her, and so she passed away in the hospital. My father also was not able to get into palliative care, but fortunately his illness was longer than my mother's, or unfortunately, depending how you look on it, and we were able to bring in private home care that was able to, ease his suffering and make sure that he was being taken care of. But also, there was no way that he was going to be able to get into palliative care within the scope of his illness. And this is something that is affecting Canadians from coast to coast to coast. And it's something that the minister has rushed to introduce this bill. Why would the minister not have introduced corollary legislation or legislation in tandem, or announce the increases in funding for palliative care? When we talk about my own riding of Dufferin-Caledon, we have a fantastic hospice for palliative care. It is called Bethell Hospice. They only have approximately 15 beds. That is the palliative care options in my riding of Dufferin-Caledon. Approximately 200,000 people, 15 palliative care beds. You can imagine there's a significant number of people who are not able to get into palliative care. And therefore, the option of medically assisted death becomes far more attractive for someone who's not able to enter into a palliative care facility. And I would repeat that that is clearly a violation of legislation that was passed by this House. When people do not have the option for proper palliative care, their consent for medically assisted death is significantly in question. So I'm extraordinarily concerned by the lack of any plan by this government to deal with investments in palliative care. And the minister has suggested that there are significant safeguards in place for people who suffer from a mental illness or are mentally any type of a mental illness. So I'm not sure what those safeguards are. She suggests that just having that condition would exclude someone from obtaining medically assisted death. But what is the definition of that? How are we defining that that is, or proving that that is the only issue? There's no requirement for someone to go to a psychiatrist in order to prove or to assess that they're not suffering from a severe bout of depression. I can say that in my own life, I have gone through extraordinary stages and phases of depression where I actually did not want to live anymore. And no, I was not seeing a psychiatrist at the time. And would I have then been able to avail myself of these services in a period of particular darkness? And we know that mental health is an issue that is rampant throughout this country. So again, I go back to my first point, which was, why are we rushing to do this? Why have we not taken the time to go through the 5-year review and to find ways to make sure we're safeguarding all Canadians and providing with the option for medically assisted death if they want it, but also ensuring that people who are choosing this, maybe because of a lack of palliative care, maybe because of some underlying mental health issues, that they are going to be protected. So these are some of the major concerns that I have with respect to this piece of legislation. When we go back and talk about consultation, I know that 2 weeks for online submissions with respect to concerns by Canadians. This is not anywhere near sufficient amount of consultation. And it was mostly, as my understanding is, online submissions. And, you know, this is not a way to get the pulse of Canadians with respect to a very significant issue that's going on in this country. And I will continue to ask why there wasn't longer or broader consultation. I know this matter will be studied at committee, but having been a member of Parliament now for going on 5.5 years, I understand the extreme limitations that go on at committee. We will often bring a panel of 6 witnesses. Those 6 witnesses will each get their 10-minute statement, and then members of Parliament might get a 6-minute intervention to try and raise an issue. So if you're going to suggest that a committee study will be far broader in scope or somewhat more encompassing than the mandatory statutory 5-year review, I'm going to respectfully disagree with that submission. I think that committees do great work, absolutely, but they also suffer from an extreme pressure of legislation and time. So to suggest that a 1 week or a 2 week or 3 meetings at committee is going to sufficiently have time to analyze and debate and discuss this legislation, I do not think that is the correct answer. We should be putting this legislation off until we have the mandatory 5-year review in June, which can allow us to have a far more expansive discussion with respect to all of the issues that are being discussed in the legislation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. These are my comments and concerns with respect to the legislation. I certainly hope that the government will listen to these concerns, act collaboratively, act cooperatively, not try and just drive this legislation through without listening to the legitimate concerns that are being raised by members of the opposition. Thank you.
Questions and commentaires. Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to pick up on the member's points in regards to the issue of palliative care, and it is something, you know, during the debates in the last session, there was a great deal of emotion that was expressed on the floor, and I really valued and appreciated the contributions by members, and I think that members from all sides of the House were really trying to get that better understanding and just the importance of what it is, the subject matter that we were debating. And the member is quite right in the sense of when you think of palliative care, that whether it's the national government, the different provincial governments who ultimately administer health care, we do need to do a much better job on palliative care. And I'm wondering if my friend from across the way can just provide some additional thoughts. And I would ask him to look specifically in areas of the country where palliative care is nowhere near where it should be or could be compared to other areas of the country. And I'm thinking maybe whether it's rural versus urban, even the variations between urban centers.
For dufferin-caledon.
Well, I appreciate the point being raised. Yes, access to palliative care across this country is a huge issue. And in fact, we're making the situation worse with the government deciding to take away funding from palliative care centres that do not offer medically assisted death as part of the suite of services that they offer. So we're losing palliative care beds across the country as a result of that decision. And I'm actually hopeful that the member hearing this and hearing this being raised by members of the opposition, they will take that back and actually look at reversing that, because the last thing we need in this country is less palliative care beds. And I would really encourage this member to speak to his leader and speak to his cabinet and get them working on this national palliative care strategy and invest money so that we have equal access to palliative care across the country.
The honourable member from Montcalm. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to tell my Conservative colleague this. He would like a psychiatrist to be the one to assess the mental health of the person who is suffering or dying. Family practitioners prescribe medication, and they are also in a position to treat depression. So a patient is given a diagnosis, and he's told there's no cure. His or her doctor is offered palliative care. However, if the patient says, I want MAID right away, well, their doctor is going to give them antidepressants. There are ways to prepare a person that happen well before. And also, this legislation excludes mental health as an underlying condition. So what is the concern exactly for my Conservative colleague? Everyone thinks that easing suffering in palliative care, regardless of whether it's in a palliative unit or not, is common practice. That is good medical practice. It happens. Pain is eased. And no one at end of life who is receiving good care is in a position where they have to ask for MAID. But if a person asks for that, then that is up to them. So that choice has to exist. That person has to have options.
Dufferin-caledon.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm not disputing that people should have options. That's certainly the whole point of the legislation. I'm not arguing against that. What I am suggesting is that there are not sufficient safeguards in place from my perspective. And while the member might say that going to see your family doctor to talk about depression is an excellent way to be treated for depression, I can tell him from my experience it is absolutely not a good option. My family doctor and most family doctors are completely incapable of treating someone for depression. They might be able to prescribe a medication, yes, but guess what? The answer to all depression is not medication. So my concern, and we're here to raise concerns, my concern is that this is not properly addressed in this legislation because I don't believe there are proper safeguards in place, and I think that's something that we should be discussing here during debate, also at committee, and certainly in the 5-year review that's going to take place in June.